So our third and final snippet for this week is going to look at the backlash against human rights diplomacy, which also becomes a backlash against an aggressive Congress in foreign affairs, because there had been this kind of pairing of the two. The idea was to sort of expand U.S. Expand congressional power as a way of promoting a human rights agenda. So as the human rights agenda becomes more controversial, so too does congressional power in foreign affairs. Within Congress, probably the most effective opponent of the kind of left-wing human rights agenda is this man, Scoop Jackson, who is a Democrat. He's a Democratic senator from Washington State, but this is a period in American history in which there are liberals and moderates and conservatives in both of the parties. It's very unlike our current arrangement. And Jackson becomes one of the most prominent advocates of a foreign policy philosophy known as neoconservatism, and that is a system in which which argues that human rights diplomacy, anti-interventionism is going too far, and that a real democratic approach is sort of a Harry Truman democratic approach. That the U.S. should be willing to fight the Cold War aggressively as it needs to do. And there is some sense that advocates of human rights diplomacy are suddenly on the defensive. In 1976, there's a very important primary in the Democratic Party for the U.S. Senate from the state of New York. And the two leading candidates are Bella Abzug, a Democratic congresswoman from Manhattan, an outspoken liberal, strong critic of the Vietnam War, strong supporter of human rights diplomacy. And then the more moderate figure, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who had served as a staffer in the Johnson administration and then had come to national prominence as Richard Nixon's UN ambassador. So, he was seen as a neoconservative in 76, although foreign policy kind of drifts to the left thereafter. And in something of an upset, Moynihan, even in a very liberal state like New York, narrowly prevails. He's helped by the fact that there's a third candidate named Ramsey Clark who is siphoning votes away from Abzug from the left. But there is this sense that maybe the public is not as enthusiastic about human rights diplomacy as it might have seemed. Same thing happens in 1976 in California. The Clark Amendment that I mentioned in the last snippet, remember that was the amendment that cut off U.S. aid to Angola. A precursor to that amendment had been, the Clark Amendment is attached to the foreign aid budget, which was being scheduled a little bit later in 1976. And an immediate cutoff of the aid occurred as a result of a defense amendment. Again, the specifics of these are not important to remember. That was sponsored by this man, John Tunney, who was a Democratic senator from California. But Tunney is then upset by a conservative Republican named S.I. Hayakawa, who becomes the first Asian American elected from to the Senate from a state on the U.S. Mainland. There had been Asian American senators from Hawaii before this, and the Hayakawa victory, just like the Moynihan victory, is seen as a repudiation of a human rights approach. That said, there's not strong support for a hardline foreign policy either in 1976. Gerald Ford tries to run. Ford, remember, he had been Nixon's vice president, takes over when Nixon resigns. He is challenged from the right in the Republican presidential primary by Ronald Reagan, the former governor of California, who gets crucial support from the most hardline member of the Senate on foreign policy issues, this man down here at the bottom named Jesse Helms, who was a Republican senator from North Carolina, and will be a major player in U.S. foreign policy during the 1980s. Ford wins most of the early primaries, but Reagan wins in Helms' home state of North Carolina, sweeps the later primaries, comes very, very close to unseating Ford, but ultimately is unable to get the nomination, and Ford goes forward as the Republican nominee. So here you can see the map how close the 1976 election was. It was basically a 50-50 race. The only recent comparison to this was the 2008 primary between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, similarly divided between the states. The Democrats nominate an obscure one-term governor of Georgia named Jimmy Carter, who runs on a campaign of honesty and ethics to move beyond the excesses of the Nixon years. Carter starts off the race with a 40-point lead over President Ford, but as the race goes on, that lead keeps dropping and dropping and dropping, and there's this sense among a lot of people that there's just not a lot of there with Carter, which I think was true. Ford's problem, though, is that Ford came across as this very, very nice man. He'd been the minority leader of the House before he's elevated to vice president when Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigns. But there was also the sense that maybe Ford didn't have the smarts to be president. That he wasn't the brightest bulb in the room, which to a certain extent was unfair. But this image becomes important. In the 1976 presidential debate between the two men, Ford is pressed on one of the critiques that Ronald Reagan had made in the primaries, which was this Helsinki Treaty, which I mentioned in the first of the snippets, which essentially acknowledged that, look, the boundaries of Europe are what they are. Communists, have a de facto control over Eastern Europe. That this was sort of consigning Eastern Europe to the Soviets. And Ford could have answered this question in one of 1,000 innocent ways. And the obvious way would have been, look, our alternative here was war. We were promoting détente. We want peace with the Soviet Union. This would have appealed to the center within the public. He could have done it in approach. Instead, he tries to explain that Poland is not really a satellite state of the Soviet Union. So it's just unfair to say that the US was even acknowledging Soviet de facto control over the region. And this confirms this plays into this image of Ford as someone who's a bit out of his league as president. So here's the exchange. This, by the way, was the first time there had been presidential debates since the election of 1960. LBJ won't do them in 64, and then Nixon, who got burned by them in 1960, refuses to do debates in either 1968 or 1972.
Mr. President, I'd like to explore a little more deeply our relationship with the Russians. Our allies in France and Italy are now flirting with communism. We've recognized a permanent communist regime in East Germany. We've virtually signed in Helsinki an agreement that the Russians have dominance in Eastern Europe.
I'm glad you raised it, Mr. Frankel. In the case of Helsinki, 35 nations signed an agreement, including the Secretary of State for the Vatican. I can't under any circumstances believe that His Holiness the Pope would agree by signing that agreement that the 35 nations have turned over to the Warsaw Pact nations the domination of Eastern Europe. It just isn't true. There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
I'm sorry, could I just follow? Did I understand you to say, sir, that the Russians are not using Eastern Europe as their own sphere of influence and occupying most of the countries there and making sure with their troops that it's a communist zone?
I don't believe, Mr. Frankel, that the Yugoslavians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Romanians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Poles consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. Each of those countries is independent, autonomous. It has its own territorial integrity. And the United States does not concede that those countries are under the domination of the Soviet Union.
This was just an extraordinary statement. I mean, Yugoslavia, of course, is different because Yugoslavia had never been under Soviet control. But the assertion that Poland was not under the domination of the Soviet Union suggested that the president wasn't particularly aware of what was going on in the world. The 76 election winds up being really, really close, and any number of things could have cost Ford the victory. But this just incredible gaffe was I think one of them. Carter, however, is elected without much of a mandate. Again, this is a guy who had a 40-point lead in the polls and winds up winning by a point or so. It's a tightly contested race in the Electoral College. There is no Democratic gain in congressional elections in '76. And Carter, who favors human rights diplomacy, says he wants to promote a greater, a renewed effort to achieve meaningful disarmament with the Soviet Union. It quickly becomes clear that he does not have enough support in Congress to do this. He nominates a man named Paul Warnke to become a director of the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. He nominates Ted Sorensen, a liberal former John Kennedy advisor, to become a director of Central Intelligence. Sorensen is forced to withdraw after conservative opposition emerges to his approach. Warnke also has his support trimmed. Warnke ultimately be confirmed, but with less than 2/3 of a vote, to what seems like a pretty obscure position. But the reason why it mattered is that Warnke was going to be the administration's point person in future arms control negotiations with the Soviet Union. You need 2/3 vote in the Senate to get a treaty through. So it's clear from the confirmation vote that that any treaty negotiated by Warnke is not going to have majority support. And these hearings are bitter. This is an excerpt from an exchange between Thomas McIntyre, a Democratic senator from New Hampshire, and Paul Nitze. Remember, we've encountered Nitze before in this class. He was the author of NSC 68. He is now one of the founders of this 70s committee called the Committee on the Present Danger, which promotes a neoconservative view, argues that Democrats, liberals in the party have become too reluctant to confront Soviet expansionism. And you can see what Nitze is calling Warnke here. And so there's a real pushback against foreign policy liberalism, against human rights diplomacy, against empowered Congress and foreign affairs that comes from key members of the foreign policy establishment. And their core critique is basically that the world is a dangerous place, and prioritizing the human rights record of putative US allies around the world is going to weaken the US vis-a-vis the Soviets. If you think of what's happening in the world in the late 70s, the human rights diplomacy has the misfortune of coinciding with this real surge of US setbacks, especially in Iran and Afghanistan, that tends to undermine the liberal worldview. Carter also spends a lot of foreign policy capital pushing through a treaty which had been negotiated under several administrations, Republicans and Democrats, but which Carter ultimately is the one who gets over the line with Panama. Here he is with the president of Panama, a former military officer named Omar Torrijos, who wants the Panama Canal back, as do most Panamanian nationalists. And the Panama Canal Treaty is a treaty that will ensure that the Panama Canal is restored to Panama by 1999. It's hard to sort of imagine this now, because I'm going to guess that there isn't anyone in this class who's even heard of the Panama Canal Treaty before this snippet. It's one of these episodes in American foreign policy that happens, and then we just sort of move along. But it is extraordinarily controversial at the time. And the reason is that there's this perception that it affirms, it demonstrates U.S. weakness in a pro-human rights diplomacy environment. Here you have this cartoon of, Carter just presenting the turkey of the Panama Canal Treaty to this Central American dictator. There's a robust right-wing opposition to the Panama Canal Treaty, which is organized by Ronald Reagan. This sort of jumpstarts Reagan's campaign for the presidency in 1980. This is a photograph of Reagan with William F. Buckley, the conservative founder of a magazine called National Review, one of the most important conservative intellectuals in the 1970s. A reminder that everything is less partisan in the 70s than it is today. Buckley is a prominent supporter of the Panama Canal Treaty. He believes that it's in the U.S. national interest. His argument is, look, we've had this colonized for 60 years. It's harming our relations with the 75 years by that point. It's harming our relations with Latin America. It's better that we just move on. on. But it's Reagan's vision that captures the public sentiment. Some members of the Senate start to become a little bit skittish, and it winds up that the determining vote on the 1978 Panama Canal Treaty will be a first-term Democratic senator from Arizona. Those of you who have been following the budget debates, I know it's hard to imagine a first-term Democratic senator from Arizona holding the fate of a president's key policy in his or her hands. Now it's Kyrsten Sinema. Then it was this guy, Dennis DeConcini, who was elected in an upset in 1976. And he becomes obsessed with this treaty. He keeps demanding changes to the treaty. But Carter, just like Biden with Sinema, needs DeConcini's vote. And so that reinforces this image of Carter as weak. Ultimately, he gets DeConcini's vote. The treaty is approved by the Senate by a 68-32 margin, which sort of gets it over the top. But Carter's foreign policy and Carter's standing in the world starts to diminish. He attempts to negotiate a new arms control treaty with the Soviet Union, which comes known as SALT II, but the Senate ultimately will never even vote on SALT II. And Carter's approval rating dropped significantly in 1978 and into 1979. It bumps up here in 1980 as a result of the Iran hostage crisis, which we'll be looking at next week. But the pattern here is that the public has a sense that American foreign policy has become erratic, and that Carter is not doing enough to prioritize American interests as opposed to broader ideological agenda, which becomes critical in the conservative revival of the 1980s. So that's all that we have for this week's snippets. I hope everyone is well.